The 22nd of August, 1914. One single turn of the sun, and by the time darkness fell over the fields of eastern France, 27,000 French soldiers were dead, not wounded, not missing, killed outright in 24 hours. Let that number settle. 27,000 men in one day. It remains, to this very hour, the single bloodiest day in the entire military history of France, worse than any day at Verdun, worse than any day on the Somme, worse than any day in the long agony that was still to come. And almost nobody remembers it, because it happened at the very start of the war, before the trenches, before the poison gas, before the world understood what it had unleashed. This slaughter did not happen by accident. It was the price of a plan built on pride, on revenge, and on a belief that courage alone could break steel. Its name was Plan 17. Its target was a strip of stolen land called Lorraine. And in 3 weeks of August and September, more than 700,000 men would be thrown into that land, in a battle historians would rank among the most decisive opening clashes of the entire war. The French marched into Lorraine singing, in red trousers and blue coats, certain of victory. Within 6 days they were running for their lives across their own frontier. And yet, out of that catastrophe, one gray-haired general would pull off a rescue so quietly brilliant that a French writer later said Paris itself was saved here, in Lorraine, before it was ever saved on the Marne. This is the story of how the First World War truly began, and it begins in disaster. To understand why French soldiers were willing to die in their thousands for a handful of Lorraine villages, go back 43 years, to 1871. In that year, Germany, newly forged into an empire, tore the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine away from a beaten France. 2 rich provinces, full of coal and iron and ancient French towns, annexed at gunpoint. For an entire generation, France did not forget. In the schoolrooms of Paris, the map of the lost provinces was draped in black, and children were raised on a single word: revenge. So, when war finally came in the summer of 1914, the French High Command did not think first of defense. It thought of return, of marching east, of tearing down the German border posts and liberating the stolen land. That hunger became strategy. The French commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, a heavy, silent man with an iron calm, had spent years preparing an offensive plan. It was the 17th such plan drawn up since the humiliation of 1871, and so it was called, simply, Plan 17. The idea was raw and aggressive. The moment war broke out, France would hurl its armies straight at the German frontier, into Alsace and into Lorraine, and carry the fight onto German soil. But the Germans had a plan of their own, and it was the mirror opposite. Their great blow would not fall here in the south. It would swing far to the north, a colossal wheeling march through Belgium and into the back of France. In the south, in Lorraine, the German armies had a colder task: to hold, to absorb the French attack, and if the chance came, to lure the attackers forward and destroy them. The French were about to march east, believing they were the hunters. The truth was that a trap was already being laid, and they were walking straight into the jaws of it. There was a cold logic to French haste. Joffre knew that with every passing month the German army, drawing on a larger population, would only grow more numerous than his own. An immediate attack, while France still had its full peacetime strength in the field, was the best card he held. So, the order went out. On the 14th of August, France would invade. Joffre gave the task of retaking Lorraine to 2 armies, and the men who led them could hardly have been more different. On the right, driving toward the fortress town of Sarrebourg, marched the French First Army under General Auguste Dubail. On the left, aimed at the fortified heights of Morhange, came the French Second Army under General Édouard de Castelnau, a careful, devout, thoughtful commander who had helped design the very plan he was now ordered to execute. Under his command marched one corps that history would remember, the 20th Corps, led by a small, fierce, fast-talking general named Ferdinand Foch, a man who believed with his whole soul in the power of the attack, and who would one day command all the Allied armies of the war. Between them, these French armies fielded roughly 300,000 men across more than 100 kilometers of rolling farmland. They were brave, they were eager, and they were about to learn that eagerness is not enough. Waiting for them was a foe far more dangerous than they imagined. The two German armies in Lorraine, the 6th and the 7th, had been placed under a single unified command, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria. Facing Dubail stood the German 7th Army under General Josias von Heeringen. Facing Castelnau stood Ruprecht's own Bavarian 6th Army. Behind Ruprecht worked two of the sharpest minds in the German service, his chief of staff, General Konrad Kraft von Dellmensingen, and his head of operations, General Hermann Merz von Quernheim, men already scheming about how to turn a French advance into a French graveyard. And the Germans held two decisive advantages that the French did not yet grasp. The first was the ground. Morhange and Sarrebourg were not open fields. They were fortified strongpoints, ringed by hills 300 meters high, laced with barbed wire, light field works, and dug-in artillery. The second advantage was the guns. German heavy howitzers could hurl their shells far beyond the range of the famous French field gun, the 75mm cannon. The French 75 was fast and deadly, but it was a light weapon. In the opening battles of Lorraine, German artillery would simply stand back and pound the French from a distance the French guns could not answer. There was one more thing. The French infantry went into battle dressed as their grandfathers had, in bright red trousers and dark blue coats, colors chosen for glory in an age before the machine gun. Against a modern rifle, against the German marksmen who were the better shots, those red trousers were not a uniform. They were a target. At first, it all seemed to go beautifully. On the 14th of August, the French armies surged across the old frontier, uprooting German border posts as they came. In the villages of German-held Lorraine, French troops were met by cheering crowds, by flowers thrown into the road, by cigarettes pressed into their hands. After 43 years of waiting, French soldiers were once again treading soil they called their own. It felt like the beginning of the promised revenge. The German troops fell back almost everywhere, withdrawing under the pressure, refusing to be pinned into a serious fight. To the advancing French, this looked like victory. Dubail's First Army pushed on towards Sarrebourg. Castelnau's Second Army took Château Salins, then Dieuze, and pressed on toward Morhange, driving as much as 20 kilometers into German territory. On the 18th of August, French troops entered Sarrebourg itself, and the bulletins sang with triumph. At a farm called Niergut, French light infantrymen found a German battle flag hidden under a pile of straw and carried it off like a holy relic. Every sign pointed one way. The enemy was running. The lost land was coming home. But it was a lie. The German withdrawal was not a rout. It was bait. Ruprecht's armies were pulling the French forward, deeper and deeper, stretching them out, luring them onto exactly the fortified ground the Germans had chosen. And there was a second, deadly flaw opening up in the French advance. As the two French armies pushed forward, they began to drift apart. A gap was yawning open between Dubail's First Army and Castelnau's Second. Joffre had warned against exactly this. His own orders, pulling the armies toward different objectives, had helped cause it. Into that widening gap, the Germans now prepared to strike. The German operations chief, Merz von Quernheim, had watched the French come on with something close to disbelief. He had written that he could not imagine the French would repeat, on a grander scale in Lorraine, the folly they had already committed in Alsace. But if they did march east of Metz in great numbers, he noted coldly, it would take little skill to bring about their downfall. Now the French were doing exactly that, and the Germans were ready. The trap sprang on the 20th of August. Ruprecht had been pressing his superiors for permission to stop retreating and turn to attack. With the agreement of the German chief of the General Staff, General Helmuth von Moltke, the order was given. Along the whole Lorraine front, the German armies stopped running and turned, all at once, on the exhausted, overextended, wide-open French. The blow fell first and hardest at Morhange. Castelnau's Second Army had been ordered forward, some of it advancing perhaps too eagerly, without waiting for the flanking troops meant to protect it. General Foch's 20th Corps in particular had pushed ahead toward Morhange, and now it was caught, hit from the front and from the side at the same moment. The German heavy guns, dug in on the high ground, opened up. Shells rained down on French infantry who had no entrenchments, no cover, and whose own light artillery could not even reach the German batteries firing at them. What happened next was not a battle, it was a massacre. French infantry, trained in the doctrine of the all-out attack, went forward in dense columns, bayonets fixed, bugles blowing the charge, officers screaming a single order over and over, forward, forward, and they walked into a wall of German machine gun fire and artillery. The Bavarian riflemen, the better marksmen, cut them down in rows. Whole waves of men in red trousers fell together and did not get up. By the afternoon, Castelnau's Second Army was breaking. Caught by surprise, without trenches, without answer to the German guns, his soldiers began to fall back. The retreat spread, and because Castelnau on the left was collapsing, Dubail on the right had no choice. To keep from being outflanked and destroyed, his First Army too had to abandon Sarrebourg, so recently and so proudly taken, and pull back. In a matter of hours, the great French offensive into Lorraine had turned into a headlong retreat toward France. Now, in the chaos of the 20th of August, comes the true climax of the Battle of Lorraine, and it unfolds in two acts. The first act is the disaster. The second act is the rescue that almost nobody expected. Picture the field at Morhange as the sun climbs. The French assault columns move up the long open slopes toward the fortified heights. The German artillery observers watch them come, unhurried, from behind the crest. The order goes out. The heavy howitzers fire. The first shells fall among the packed French ranks, and the neat columns dissolve into smoke and torn earth. The men press forward anyway, because that is the doctrine, the sacred faith of the attack. The bugles sound the charge again. The Bavarian machine guns open up across the open ground. Men in red trousers go down in swaths, and behind them the next wave steps over the bodies and keeps climbing, and the guns keep firing. And by mid-afternoon the slope below Morhange is carpeted with the French dead. When Crown Prince Ruprecht rode out to survey the battlefield the next morning and looked across the endless scatter of bright red trousers among the grass, he is said to have remarked that the dead looked like a field of poppies. That was the enemy commander's own verdict on the French attack. A field of poppies. It is one of the most haunting images of the entire war, and it came in its very first weeks. Foch's 20th Corps, hit from front and flank, suffered terribly and lost more than 20 of its guns to the enemy, and yet it did not shatter. It gave ground slowly, fighting, and by holding together it helped shield the retreat of the whole army from becoming a total rout. Elsewhere the collapse was near complete. Within hours, most of Castelnau's Second Army was streaming back through the very towns it had liberated days before, many of them now burning. By the 22nd of August, both French armies were back inside France, thrown all the way to the fortress lines they had started from. 6 days of triumph, erased in a single afternoon of fire. The roads east were choked with the wounded, the guns, and the shattered pride of an army that had marched out singing. For the German High Command, this looked like the doorway to total victory. Moltke, at his headquarters, faced a tempting choice. The apparent collapse of the French Second Army seemed to open the possibility of a battle of annihilation, a great encirclement that could trap every French soldier in Lorraine and the Ardennes at once. And there was a natural gateway for it. Between the French fortress cities of Toul and Epinal lay a wide, unfortified corridor, roughly 70 kilometers across, known as the Gap of Charms. If the Germans could pour through that gap, they would split the two French armies apart and roll up the entire French line from the flank. Moltke decided to pursue. He kept his left wing at full strength, 26 divisions, and ordered Ruprecht's Bavarians to drive for the Gap of Charms, straight at the seam where Castelnau's army met Dubail's. This is the moment the story turns, because General de Castelnau, beaten and reeling, did not fall apart. He fell back onto a fortress of ground he had known for years. The ridges east of the city of Nancy, called the Grande Couronne, the Great Crown, and there, on those heights, the beaten man began to think like a hunter. French aircraft flew over the advancing German columns and brought back a priceless report. The Germans, ignoring the threat of Nancy on their flank, were marching hard to the southwest, straight for the Gap of Charms, presenting their own flank as they went. Castelnau saw it instantly. The enemy was doing exactly what he needed. He would let Dubail's First Army form the anvil, holding firm across the line of the rivers, while his own Second Army, perched up on the Grande Couronne, came down like a hammer onto the exposed German flank. The trap that had been sprung on the French at Morhange was about to be turned inside out. On the 24th of August, the German Sixth Army attacked into the Gap of Charms. At first it worked. The Germans took the villages of Damelivieres and Gerbeviller, pushed the French out of wood after wood, and drove toward the town of Bayonne and the crossings of the Moselle. If they reached the far bank, the sources agree, almost nothing could have stopped them rolling on into the heart of France. But the French Second Army began to hold. One regiment in particular, the 74th Infantry, fought with such stubbornness that the German attacks on the Flainval Plateau were thrown back. Then Castelnau struck. Around the village of Roseleurs, only 15 kilometers from the Moselle, the fighting reached its knife edge. The Germans took the village. The French counterattacked at 7 in the morning and retook it. The Bavarians hit back an hour later and seized it again. And onto the heights of Bourville above that killing ground, helped by local villagers, the French hauled up their artillery, some 60 of the fast-firing 75mm guns, and turned the crest into a wall of fire. Now it was the German columns, funneled into the valleys below, that were caught in the open under a storm of shell fire they could not escape. To force the gap, the Germans stripped troops from their flanks and shoved them into the center. Castelnau pounced on the weakened flanks. He sent divisions down off the Grande Couronne, one of them under General Émile Fayolle, smashing into the German wings, driving them out of village after village. The Bavarian Second Corps, jammed into a valley walled by hills, bristling with French guns that never stopped firing, was blocked and torn apart. And something began to happen in the German ranks that had happened to the French only days before. The men who had felt like conquerors began to break. During their retreat, German troops were struck by waves of panic, and cries went up along their lines of every man for himself. The mighty French 75, which had been outranged at Morhange, was now the master of the field. By the 26th of August, the Battle of the Gap of Charms was a clear French victory. Castelnau, the beaten man of Morhange, had halted the German drive and hurled it back, but the Germans were not finished. In early September they came again, this time straight at Nancy itself, hammering the defenses of the Grande Couronne from the 4th of September onward in a grinding battle that raged for more than a week. Attack and counterattack rolled across the heights. The French bent, but did not break, and in the night between the 11th and 12th of September, with their great advance far to the west collapsing on the Marne, the Germans finally let go of the Grande Couronne and pulled back. By the 13th of September, the Battle of Lorraine was over. The front there would barely move again for 4 long years. Step back from the maps and the arrows now, and look at the price. At Morhange alone, the best estimates speak of around 5,000 French dead. Of those, barely 1,500 could ever be identified, because so many soldiers were not yet wearing identity tags. Thousands of men, erased so completely that not even their names could be given back to their families. The wounded numbered perhaps 15,000, and most of them, left on a battlefield with no medical system able to cope with slaughter on such a scale, were simply taken prisoner where they fell. And that single day, the 22nd of August, across the whole chain of frontier battles of which Lorraine was the southern hinge, cost France 27,000 dead. In one day. It is a figure that still has the power to stop the breath. But numbers, however vast, can go numb. So let one man stand for all of them. General de Castelnau, the commander of the Second Army, had sent 5 of his own sons to the war. On the 20th of August, at a village called Pévange, close to Morhange, His son, Xavier, a young officer of 20, was killed leading his men, holding off the German attack to cover his battalion's retreat. He was the last officer of his company still alive, and he took command, and he held, and he fell. According to the accounts that grew up around that day, when the news of his son's death was brought to Castelnau in the middle of the battle, the general, who was directing an army of 250,000 men, fell silent for a moment, and then turned back to his staff and his maps and said only, "Let us continue, gentlemen." Whether he spoke those exact words that hour, or in the grief of the days that followed, the meaning is the same. He kept command. Before the war was over, 3 of his sons would be dead and another lost as a prisoner. Behind every red-trousered figure on that field of poppies was a father, a family, a name. Nor were the soldiers the only ones to suffer. As the offensive collapsed, the German army turned on the Lorraine civilians who had welcomed the invaders, with reprisals that meant shootings, burned houses, and deportations. At the town of Gerberviller, where French light infantry had held a bridge all day against overwhelming numbers before falling back, the Germans took a savage revenge on the town and its people, and in the wooded passes of the Vosges to the south, at the Col de la Chipote, the fighting was so desperate that the position changed hands 5 times in a fortnight. Men called it simply the Pass of the Dead. So who won the Battle of Lorraine? The honest answer is, both sides, and neither, in the space of a single month. The Germans won the opening round, and won it crushingly. Morhange and Sarreburg were among the most complete tactical defeats the French army suffered in the entire war. Ruprecht of Bavaria came out of it with a new nickname, the Victor of Metz, and a reputation as the man who had shattered the French offensive in the south. For those first days, it looked as though the Germans had not only stopped the French but had opened the road to catastrophe. But then the French won the second round, the round that mattered more. Castelnau's stand at the Gap of Charms and on the Grande Couronne did not merely stop the German counteroffensive, it broke something in the German command. The unexpected defeat at Charmes shook Ruprecht's headquarters, where a mood close to discouragement set in, and the German troops who had been so confident were rattled to their core by the sheer weight of fire from the French 75. When the Germans finally abandoned their assault on Nancy and pulled back on the 13th of September, they left the French right flank unbroken and the city of Nancy in French hands, where it would stay for the rest of the war. The final image of Lorraine is not a French army in glorious advance, nor a German army in triumph. It is a long, exhausted line of men on both sides digging into the hills east of Nancy, settling into positions that would barely shift for 4 years, while the true decision of the campaign was carried far to the west, to a river called the Marne. Lorraine did not end the war, but without what happened here, the war might have ended very differently, and very soon, and not in France's favor. Here is why the Battle of Lorraine mattered far beyond its own bloody fields. Remember Moltke's fateful choice. When the French Second Army seemed to collapse after Morhange, the German Chief of Staff was tempted by the dream of total encirclement, and to chase it he kept his entire left wing in Lorraine at full strength, 26 divisions, and threw them at the Gap of Charms. Those were 26 divisions that were not sweeping through the north. They were pinned here, in the south, being ground down at Roselieures and on the Grande Couronne, at the very hour when the great German blow through Belgium was supposed to be delivering the war-winning knockout. By holding firm, by refusing to break, Castelnau and Dubail did something that reached across the whole map of France. They kept the German left wing chained to Lorraine. They denied it the freedom to reinforce the Great Wheel in the north at the very moment that wheel was reaching for Paris. And when that northern advance was finally halted and thrown back at the First Battle of the Marne in early September, the men who had bled to hold Lorraine had helped make that miracle possible. A French writer of the time put it in words that have echoed ever since. If Paris was saved at the Marne, he said, it was because Castelnau had won at Roselieures. It is a stunning claim that the survival of the French capital in the most famous battle of 1914 traced back to a beaten general making a stand on a ridge in Lorraine. And yet the logic holds. The refusal to be encircled, the wall of fire that stopped the Bavarians short of the Moselle, All of it kept the French right anchored and the German plan off balance at the hinge moment of the war. Lorraine was the disaster that made the deliverance possible. Where, then, does the Battle of Lorraine rank among the great clashes of the First World War? Give the giants their due first. The First Battle of the Marne, fought at the same time to the west, is rightly remembered as the battle that saved France and doomed the German plan of a quick war. Verdun, in 1916, became a 10-month furnace of shellfire, one of the most terrible battles in human history. Tannenberg, in the east, was a German masterpiece that destroyed an entire Russian army. Against names like these, Lorraine is barely spoken of. And yet consider what Lorraine actually was. It was the true opening of the war in the West, the first great collision of the main French and German armies. It produced the single bloodiest day in the history of France, a record even Verdun and the Somme never broke. It shattered, in a matter of days, the entire French doctrine of the reckless offensive, a lesson written in tens of thousands of lives. And it delivered, out of catastrophe, a defensive victory so important that a serious case can be made. It saved the French right flank and helped make the miracle of the Marne possible. The verdict is this: Lorraine is not the most famous battle of the First World War, and it never will be, but it may be the most underrated. It was the moment the dream of a short, glorious war of revenge died in the mud and the machine gun fire, the moment both armies learned what this new war truly was. Few battles in all of history taught so brutal a lesson so quickly, and fewer still hid inside a crushing defeat, a rescue that helped save a nation. Lorraine deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, but as the terrible doorway through which the entire war walked in. The men who marched east, singing, in their red trousers, chasing a 43-year-old dream of return, met a war that no song had prepared them for, and most of them never marched home. But the line they died to hold, the ridges of Nancy, held, and a beaten general standing on a hill turned a massacre into the first faint hope of victory. The German plan to win the war in a single sweep was already beginning to crack, here in the south, before it ever reached the river where it would finally break. And that river is where we go next. Join us for the full story of the First Battle of the Marne, the 6 days that saved Paris and doomed Germany to the 4 years of trench warfare it had gambled everything to avoid.